The quantum spurs on Mike Matterhorn's boots hadn't flared blue in almost a year. They rested on pegs beside the door of his prefab ranch house next to his family's ancestral blade. Its quantum matrix dormant but not forgotten. 7 years with the Texas Knights had taught him how to fight everything from the Red Pirates to the Insectoid Hive Collective across a dozen systems. But nothing had prepared him for the isolation of Hellgate 7. A frontier world where just breathing outside without a filter, mask, was considered a victory. "You ain't a man if you got no land." His grandfather's words echoed in Mike's mind as he stood on his porch, watching his Rambouillet sheep graze between rows of hardy mesquite and cypress. Old Joshua Matterhorn had repeated that phrase like scripture, right up until the mega corporations had foreclosed on the family's ranch back on Earth. The day they'd lost that land, 7 generations of Matterhorn's stewardship erased by corporate signatures had changed something in Mike's young heart. He had joined the Knights the next day, barely 17. 7 years of service had earned him enough to make the down payment on this harsh slice of frontier, 40,000 acres of Hellgate's most inhospitable terrain with nothing but a natural spring and breathable, if barely, atmosphere to recommend it. The land deed was framed inside, hanging beside his grandfather's ancient Stetson, proof that a Matterhorn once again had land to call his own. Mike's ranch AI, a simple model nicknamed Tex, chimed from his wristcom. "Perimeter sensor 17 has gone offline, boss. 3rd one this week." Mike frowned. Equipment failures weren't uncommon on Hellgate 7. The planet's name had been well earned. But 3 in the same sector raised his night-trained suspicions. "Run a diagnostic. Might be those silicon beetles again." The native insects had a peculiar appetite for electronics. They'd already cost him 2 irrigation nodes last month. "Diagnostic inconclusive," Tex responded after a moment. "Pattern doesn't match known beetle activity." Mike squinted at the horizon where his property extended for miles in every direction. His nearest neighbor, old Jameson with his experimental fungus farm, was 12 miles east and rarely left his climate-controlled domes. The colonial settlement was nearly 100 miles south, a collection of prefabs and landing pads that barely qualified as a town. Out here, you were on your own. That's why Mike had chosen it. After 7 years of night discipline and coordinated combat, he'd wanted space, solitude, a chance to build something instead of defending what others had built. "Keep monitoring," he told Tex, turning to check his irrigation systems. The silvopasture required careful water management, especially during Hellgate's scorching 40-hour days. The natural spring that had given his ranch its name was the only reliable water source for 50 miles, a liquid treasure on this parched world. By mid-afternoon, he was elbow-deep in one of the primary water pumps when Tex interrupted with unusual urgency. "Multiple perimeter breaches detected, eastern quadrant. Unidentified movement patterns." Mike's head snapped up, night instincts flaring to life. "Show me." A holographic display flickered from his wristcom, but the imagery was distorted. "Sensor degradation at 80%, Tex reported, unable to provide clear visuals. Something was jamming his sensors, or consuming them. Mike wiped greasy hands on his worn denim pants and moved with sudden purpose toward the ranch house. Inside, his eyes went directly to the quantum spurs and sword that had served him through a dozen campaigns. "Run full-spectrum analysis," he ordered, as he began donning the night armor he hadn't worn in a year. Each piece clicked into place with familiar precision, power cells activating systems that hummed back to life after their long dormancy. "Analysis complete," Tex reported as Mike secured his helmet. "Subsurface movement detected. Pattern matches no known native species. Estimated size of organisms concerning." Mike's jaw tightened as he strapped the sword to his back. "Define concerning, Tex." "Approximately 3 meters in length. Multiple appendages. Density suggests chitinous exoskeleton. They're moving in formation, boss." "No silicon beetle, then. Something new. Something organized." "Alert Jameson and the settlement," Mike ordered, activating his quantum spurs. They flared blue against the floor, neural interfaces syncing with his armor's systems. "Tell them to secure all water sources immediately. Communications are being disrupted," Tex responded. "Signal degradation at 95%. Mike cursed under his breath. Whatever these things were, they were cutting him off. Standard predator tactics. He'd seen similar strategies employed by the Hive Collective, isolating human settlements before. A thought struck him with cold clarity. He moved to his workstation and pulled up the planetary survey that had accompanied his land grant. It was sparse. Hellgate 7 had been rushed into the colonial program due to its breathable atmosphere despite the harsh conditions. Initial surveys had found minimal complex life forms, but there, buried in an appendix, possible subsurface cavernous structures detected in eastern quadrants. Further investigation deferred due to resource limitations. "Tex, where's the nearest detected movement to the main flock?" "Eastern pasture. Estimated 8 minutes from primary grazing area." Mike was already moving, quantum spurs flaring blue with each step as he headed for the equipment shed. His hoverbike roared to life as he swung into the saddle, night armor interfacing seamlessly with the vehicle's systems. "Keep trying to reach Jameson," he ordered, "and activate all auxiliary irrigation pumps. I want maximum water flow through the eastern pastures." If these were burrowing predators awakened by his terraforming efforts, flooding their tunnels might slow them down. It would waste precious water, but water could be replaced. His sheep, the specialized breeding stock that represented 5 years of careful genetic selection and his entire financial future, could not. The hoverbike shot across the silvo pasture, scattering sheep as Mike raced toward the eastern perimeter. Through his helmet's enhanced vision, he could see soil disturbances, subtle mounds and depressions that wouldn't be visible to the naked eye. Whatever was down there was big, moving fast, and headed straight for the main flock. He was still half a mile from the eastern pasture when the ground erupted in front of him. Mike barely had time to swerve as something massive burst through the soil, a nightmare of chitinous armor and segmented limbs. His night training took over, quantum spurs interfacing with the bike's systems as he executed a maneuver that would have been impossible for a conventional rider. The hoverbike looped up and over the creature, giving him a clear view of what he faced. "Holy Mother of Texas," he breathed. The thing was like a centipede crossed with a scorpion, easily 4 meters long. Its segmented body was protected by iridescent armor plates, and multiple compound eyes tracked his movement with predatory intelligence. Most concerning were the twin mandibles that dripped with some viscous fluid, leaving smoking holes where it touched the soil. Acid. His sword hummed as he drew it, the quantum matrix recognizing his genetic signature even through his armored gloves. The blade had been carried by 3 generations of Matterhorns before him, its matrix encoded with combat experiences against dozens of alien species. None quite like this, though. The creature lunged with surprising speed. Mike's sword flashed, quantum edge meeting chitinous armor with a sound like splintering glass. The blade cut through, but not as deeply as he'd expected. The creature recoiled, mandibles clicking in what might have been pain or rage. Then the ground began to tremble all around him. "Tex!" Mike shouted, spinning the hoverbike in a defensive circle. "Where's the main flock?" "Primary breeding stock has been moved to the central barn," the AI responded through static. "General population is scattered. Multiple subsurface predators have emerged throughout the eastern pastures." More eruptions of soil confirmed Tex's assessment as at least a dozen more creatures burst into the harsh sunlight. Unlike the mindless silicon beetles, these moved with coordinated purpose, forming a loose semicircle around Mike, while others headed toward the distant shapes of fleeing sheep. His HUD flashed a proximity warning an instant before one creature launched itself at his back. Mike dropped the hoverbike into a controlled fall, rolling free as the massive arthropod collided with his vehicle. His quantum spurs left blue fire trails as he came up in a combat stance, sword humming with ancestral knowledge. "My name is Mike Matterhorn of the Texas Knights," he called out, though he doubted the creatures understood. Still, Knight protocol for encountering new species always started with identification. "This land is under my protection by Colonial Charter 447B. Stand down or be neutralized." The creature's response was immediate and unambiguous. 3 charged simultaneously, mandibles extended, and acid spraying in arterial jets. Mike's sword moved in patterns perfected over centuries of night combat, the quantum matrix calculating optimal strike points against the unfamiliar anatomy. The first creature fell, its head separated from its segmented body. The second lost 2 primary limbs but continued its attack, driven by fury or hunger. The third managed to graze Mike's armor with its acid spray, alerts immediately flashing on his HUD as the corrosive hum began eating through his left shoulder plate. "Tex," Mike grunted as he drove his sword through the second creature's central mass. "Get me satellite imagery. I need to know how many we're dealing with." "Attempting to access colonial satellites," the AI responded. "Atmospheric interference is, wait, detecting unusual seismic activity beneath the spring source." Mike's blood went cold. If these creatures damaged the spring that fed his entire irrigation system, his moment of distraction cost him. One of the smaller creatures latched onto his right leg, mandibles scraping against his armor. Warnings flashed as acid began compromising the integrity of his quantum spur interface. With a roar that owed as much to rage as pain, Mike drove his sword straight down through the thing's central nervous cluster. It died, but more were emerging. His HUD was picking up seismic disturbances throughout the eastern quadrant now, spreading in and this wasn't a random attack. It was a coordinated emergence. "Boss," Tex's voice carried genuine alarm now. "Seismic analysis suggests these are juvenile specimens." Mike cleaved another creature in half, quantum spurs struggling to maintain stability as his right boot interface deteriorated. Meaning something much larger is coming." As if summoned by the AI's words, the ground began to tremble with increasing violence. Mike's combat-enhanced reflexes barely saved him as the earth split open 50 meters away, revealing a nightmare that made the previous creatures look like household pests. The thing that emerged was the size of his barn, a monstrous queen or matriarch to the smaller attackers. Its segmented body was encased in armor that shimmered with metallic highlights, and multiple limbs ended in specialized appendages, some like pincers, others like serrated blades. Most terrifying were the twin sensory stalks that rose from its head, swiveling independently to track both Mike and the distant sheep. "Tex," Mike whispered, sword suddenly feeling inadequate. "Activate Irrigation Protocol Omega. Divert all water resources to the central compound." "Confirmed. But, boss, that'll flood the lower pastures and dry out the eastern quadrant completely." "Do it," Mike ordered, watching as the matriarch began coordinating its offspring with complex movements of its sensory stalks. "And prepare the emergency beacon. If I don't stop this thing, the settlement needs to know what's coming." Night training emphasized tactical assessment before engagement. Mike knew he was outmatched in direct combat against the matriarch, but 7 years of night service had taught him that victory didn't always require defeating an enemy. Sometimes changing the battlefield was enough. His armor systems were already rerouting power to compensate for the acid damage. His right quantum spur was operating at only 60% efficiency, limiting his mobility. But the ground beneath his feet was already growing damp as Irrigation Protocol Omega diverted thousands of gallons from his reservoirs into the surrounding soil. The smaller creatures noticed first, their movements becoming erratic as water saturated their tunnels. Several retreated underground, only to emerge elsewhere in obvious distress. The matriarch, however, seemed unconcerned by the growing moisture. Its focus remained on Mike and the distant sheep. It charged with shocking speed for its size, covering half the distance before Mike could activate his hoverbike's emergency recovery protocol. The damaged vehicle limped toward him, systems sputtering. "Texas Knights don't retreat," Mike muttered to himself, sword raised in defiance. "But we sure as hell know how to reposition." He leapt aboard the hover bike as it passed, quantum spurs interfacing despite the damage. The bike responded sluggishly, barely lifting him above the charging matriarch's reach. One massive limb clipped the vehicle's undercarriage, sending it into a spin that only night reflexes allowed Mike to control. Rather than fleeing toward the ranch house, Mike drove the damaged hoverbike straight toward the spring source. If these creatures had evolved in Hellgate's harsh environment, water might be their primary target. And his greatest weapon. The matriarch changed direction with frightening intelligence, cutting to intercept him. Its smaller offspring were struggling now, the saturated ground clearly hampering their movements. Some were being washed away as irrigation channels overflowed, carrying them tumbling across the silva pasture. Mike's gamble was taking shape. These weren't random predators. They were a hibernating species that his terraforming had awakened. A species adapted to Hellgate's arid conditions, possibly emerging only when they detected significant water sources. Like the spring he'd built his ranch around, the underground reservoir that fed Silver Creek Ranch was his most precious resource, carefully managed through a pump house that regulated flow to the entire silvopasture system. As Mike approached the structure, he could see the ground around it writhing with smaller creatures attempting to burrow into the pumping station. His sword flashed as he swept past, quantum edge cleaving through multiple attackers. He brought the hoverbike down hard beside the pump house, quantum spurs flaring as he dismounted. Tex, status on Protocol Omega. Eastern reservoirs at 8% capacity, western overflow channels at maximum, central compound secure. Good. Mike turned to face the approaching matriarch. Its massive form thundering across ground now slick with artificial flooding. Now, reverse it. All pumps at maximum. I want every drop from the main reservoir pushed to the surface. Authorization Matterhorn Knight 773. Boss, that'll drain our emergency reserves completely. The silvopasture will die without my say-so anyway if these things take the spring. Mike's sword hummed as he adjusted its quantum harmonics, tuning the blade to maximum penetration settings. Do it now! The pump house thrummed with sudden energy as massive subterranean pumps engaged at emergency capacity. Water began gushing from overflow valves, creating an expanding pool around the structure. The smaller creatures retreated from the growing flood, but the matriarch pressed forward, its compound eyes fixed on Mike with predatory focus. Come on, you ugly son of a hive queen, Mike muttered, quantum spurs flaring blue against the increasingly sodden ground. Let's see if you can swim. The matriarch charged, multiple limbs tearing gouges in the earth. Mike held his ground until the last possible moment, then activated his spurs emergency thrust protocol. The quantum technology propelled him straight up and over the creature's head, his sword trailing blue fire as he executed a perfect night aerial strike pattern. The blade bit deep into one sensory stalk, severing it completely. The matriarch's shriek was like metal grinding against stone, its massive body whipping around with unexpected agility. One armored limb caught Mike mid-landing, sending him crashing into the pump house wall. Warnings flashed across his head. Armor integrity compromised, left arm servos damaged, helmet atmospheric seal at 60%. But the ground around them was now ankle-deep in water, expanding rapidly as the pumps drew from deep underground reserves. The matriarch seemed to hesitate, its remaining sensory stalk waving frantically as it assessed the changing conditions. Around them, the smaller creatures were retreating, burrowing away from the spreading water. Mike pushed himself upright, sword still humming in his hand. That's right, he called out, night bravado masking the pain of what were likely several broken ribs. This ain't your world anymore. This is Texas territory now. The creature charged again, but its movements were less certain in the deepening water. Mike's damaged quantum spurs struggled to maintain traction, but the sword in his hand carried generations of night expertise. It moved almost of its own accord, guided by the quantum matrix that stored centuries of combat experience. The blade found a seam between the matriarch's armor plates, penetrating deep into whatever passed for its vital organs. Noxious fluid sprayed from the wound, mixing with the floodwater now reaching mid-calf depth. The creature recoiled, limbs thrashing in apparent agony. Mike pressed his advantage, sword moving in the traditional Texas night offensive pattern that had broken the Red Pirates at the Battle of New Andrea. Each strike found another weakness, another gap in the creature's formidable defenses. But the matriarch was far from finished. One powerful limb swept around, catching Mike squarely in the chest. His armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force still sent him flying into the now submerged landscape. Water closed over his helmet as he struggled to regain his footing, systems warning of complete failure of his right quantum spur. Through the murky flood, he saw the matriarch advancing. Slower now, wounded and clearly stressed by the deepening water, but still determined, its remaining sensory stalk fixed on the pump house itself, the source of the water that was changing its domain. Mike understood in a flash of night tactical assessment. It wasn't after his sheep. It wasn't even primarily after him. It wanted to destroy the water source that was threatening its species' hibernation grounds. "Tex!" he gasped, finally regaining his feet in water now reaching his thighs. "Maximum output. Push it past emergency protocols. Authorization, Matterhorn final stand. Acknowledged," the AI responded. "Warning, pump infrastructure may suffer catastrophic failure at such levels." "That's the idea," Mike muttered, raising his sword as the matriarch closed the distance between them. "Buying us time, one way or another." The pump house whined as machinery was pushed beyond safety limits. Water surged around them now, the flood spreading visibly across the landscape. In the distance, Mike could see his sheep, safely corralled on high ground, the ranch house secure on its artificial rise. Everything else, the carefully cultivated silvopasture, the irrigation systems he'd spent years installing, the future he'd planned, was being sacrificed to stop this ancient threat. The matriarch reared up, reaching nearly 8 meters high as it prepared for a final assault. Mike's HUD flickered with damage reports, his armor compromised in multiple locations. The quantum spurs that had carried him through dozens of night campaigns were failing, one completely dead and the other operating at minimal capacity. But the sword in his hand still hummed with the unbreakable spirit of Texas determination. Its quantum matrix sang with the memories of battles won against impossible odds, of last stands that had become legendary victories, of knights who had faced extinction and returned with tales of triumph. "My name is Mike Matterhorn," he called out, raising the blade in formal night challenge. "This land is under my protection. By the authority of the Texas Knights and the spirit of my ancestors, I'm giving you one last chance to retreat." The matriarch's response was to strike, multiple limbs descending like the wrath of some ancient god. Mike's remaining quantum spur flared with desperate energy as he executed a maneuver that had been perfected in the vacuum of space, but never tested in waist-deep water on a frontier world. His blade met the creature's attack at precisely the right angle, quantum harmonics discharging into its nervous system. The matriarch convulsed, momentum carrying it forward into the pump house structure. Metal groaned, pipes burst, and water exploded upward as primary pressure containment failed. The resulting geyser shot 50 meters into Hellgate's atmosphere, raining down on both combatants. Mike was thrown clear by the blast, his armor's emergency systems barely keeping him conscious as he landed hard on relatively dry ground at the edge of the artificial flood. Through blurred vision, he watched as the matriarch thrashed in what was quickly becoming a small lake. The creature's movements grew increasingly desperate as water reached critical depths, its evolutionary adaptations to Hellgate's arid environment now working against it. Its armored segments began to swell as they absorbed the flood, weighing it down, restricting its movement. Mike tried to rise, to finish what he'd started, but his armor was locked in emergency preservation mode. All he could do was watch as the matriarch slowly succumbed to the very element that Mike had fought so hard to bring to this parched world. Around them, the smaller creatures had long since retreated, burrowing deep to escape the unnatural flood. In the distance, warning klaxons sounded from the ranch house as techs reported system failures across the silvopasture. But the sheep were safe. The matriarch was dying, and Mike Matterhorn, former Texas Knight and stubborn terraformer, was still breathing Hellgate's thin air. "Tex," he croaked. "Damage assessment, catastrophic pump failure," the AI reported. 87% of irrigation systems offline, water reserves at critical levels, estimated recovery time with current resources 342 days. Almost a full Hellgate year. Everything he'd built set back to nearly the beginning. And the threat? Primary organism showing no signs of mobility. Smaller specimens have retreated beyond sensor range. Seismic activity diminishing across all quadrants. Mike finally managed to push himself to a sitting position, armor creaking in protest. Across the newly formed lake, he could see the matriarch's still form, half submerged and unmoving. Beyond it, his silvopasture was a ruin of flooded fields and uprooted trees. But he could rebuild. Knights always did. His quantum spurs might be damaged, his irrigation systems destroyed, his carefully cultivated land transformed into a muddy wasteland. But Matilda and her lambs still grazed on high ground. The spring source, though temporarily disrupted, would recover, and the knowledge he'd gained about Hellgate's native species would be invaluable, both to his own recovery efforts and to the safety of the entire colony. As the twin suns began their slow descent toward the horizon, painting the floodwaters with crimson light, Mike Matterhorn looked out over what remained of Silver Creek Ranch and felt something unexpected: pride. Not in what he'd lost, but in what he'd protected. Not in the battle he'd nearly lost, but in the stand he'd taken. "Tech," he said, watching as distant dust on the horizon suggested approaching vehicles. Probably Jameson and others responding to the emergency beacon. "Send a message to Colonial Headquarters. Tell them," he paused, considering his words carefully. "Tell them Texas still stands on Hellgate 7, battered but unbroken." His sword hummed softly at his side, its quantum matrix storing yet another battle in the long legacy of the Matterhorn family. Another story to be passed down, another moment when a single knight had stood against impossible odds. Not for glory, not for conquest, but for the simple, unshakable Texan belief that what's yours, you protect, no matter what crawls out of the ground to challenge you. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. Video shares, memberships, and super thanks help the channel grow as well, so feel free to partner with this channel in that way as we grow. With that all said, thank you again for listening to the story, and thank you for your time. On the left side of your screen are some videos I think you might be interested in. I hope to see you in the next one.